everyone's talking about reparations.
Yes.
And I support reparations.
Yes.
But I don't support the way we're going about it. I got 3 issues with reparations. Number 1, getting a payout in any amount from the United States government right now in 2019, 2020 would be the worst thing we could do, because we have no community infrastructure, Mary, to trap the money in the inside. You just said it. The black dollar circulates 2 hours before it runs away. So if they gave us 20 trillion, 100 trillion, $1 million trillion, that money would be gone in 2 days. In fact, I would argue that white folks and Chinese is praying you get your reparations.
Dr. Umar has been going around the Chitlin circuit, giving his unsolicited opinion on reparations, and recently he stopped by the Breakfast Club. And while he does make some valid points when it comes to other subjects, when it comes to reparations, Dr. Umar just can't get it right. Dr. Umar, I thought we had an agreement that you wouldn't say nothing about the reparations movement and we wouldn't say nothing about the FDMG Academy. But here we go again. Anyway, let's get into this video. I'm gonna break down where Dr. Umar was wrong.
Well, let's take it a step further. The state of California legislature just approved in the past few days a bill that will give each African American in the state of California $233,000 as a reparations payment.
I think that's some bullshit. I think Gavin Newsom is just doing that because reparations is going to be the buzzword for 2024 to get black people energized.
It is, and it's also a trap. Now, first of all, the reparations movement comes out of the Pan-Africanist movement. We gave birth to reparations. It's not anything new. That's our thing, although it's for the whole people.
There was a lot of misinformation being shared around reparations payments in California this week. This Mogulum article got it right. The fact is, an economist hired by the California's Reparations Task Force recommended an estimation for housing discrimination. The task force didn't submit anything, and legislation didn't pass no laws. Most importantly, the reparation movement comes out of the American Freedman Project. Before the end of the Civil War, efforts for Reconstruction had already started. General Sherman would meet with a group of clergymen, led by Garrison Frazier. In this meeting, they would discuss how to get blacks oppressed under the American institution of slavery, who would now all become American freedmen, ways to get acclimated into American society. What comes out of this meeting is Special Field Order 15. The reparationist movement comes out of the American Freedman Project and Reconstruction. It doesn't come from the Pan-Africanist movement. Sorry, Umar, you're wrong.
Reparations bring every group that was responsible, those who financed the slave ships.
That'd be Nigerians too, though.
Okay, let's talk about that. There was participation from some African kingdoms. We know that Dahomey, for example, which was popularized in the Lion King movie. The Woman King movie. There was some African participation, but guess what? The transatlantic slave trade was a European operation. It was controlled. It grew. It was financed by Europeans. When many of the African nations found out what was really being done to us, because in Africa, there was no concept of chattel slavery. There was no such thing as owning people forever. There was no such thing as perpetual ownership of an entire family line or a bloodline. You understand? There was no such thing as being dehumanized. European slavery stripped African people of our humanity. There's no precedent for that in the world before European chattel slavery. They didn't know what they were getting into. They were wrong and can be held accountable.
The first step to healing is acceptance. My people, we really got to get out of this state of denial. At least a century before the transatlantic slave trade, the continent of Africa had a burgeoning slave trade. Since Charlemagne brought up Nigeria, let's talk about Nigeria for a minute. There's a great article by the New Yorker titled, "My Great-Grandfather, the Nigerian Slave Trader." Here's an excerpt from this article. Long before Europeans arrived, Igbos enslaved other Igbos as punishment for crime, for the payment of debts, and as prisoners of war. The practice differed from slavery in the Americas. Slaves were permitted to move freely in their communities and to own property, but they were also sometimes sacrificed in religious ceremonies or buried alive with their masters to serve them in the next life. When the transatlantic trade began in the 15th century, the demand for slaves spiked. Igbo traders began kidnapping people from distant villages, Sometimes the family would sell off a disgraced relative. In the late 19th century, her grandfather carried a slave trading license from the Royal Niger Company, an English corporation that ruled southern Nigeria. His agents captured slaves across the region and passed them to middlemen, who brought them to the ports of Bonny and Calabar and sold them to white merchants. Funeral rites for a distinguished Igbo man traditionally included the slaying of livestock, usually as many cows as his family can afford. In Wabani, Ogogu was so esteemed that when he died, a leper was killed and 6 slaves were buried alive with him. There's nothing humane about being buried alive, nothing at all. And while the transatlantic slave trade would eventually become more brutal, this would not have been possible without participation from certain African kingdoms. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, nearly 1.5 million Igbo slaves were sent across the Middle Passage. You seriously believe these Nigerian slave traders didn't know where they was getting into? Where they was sending other people from their community and surrounding regions into? They knew exactly what was going on in America. You know how I know? There are stories of Nigerian kings and dignitaries who sent their children on slave ships to get educated from universities in America. And then they was able to come back to Africa as free men.
Because they suffered during colonization as much as we did in slavery. So I reject any proposal that wants to make African people more liable for slavery than the white people who owned, controlled, expanded, and benefited.
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah, they're definitely not more liable. It's just like you said, everybody
nor are they equally liable.
Equally. Everybody needs to be at the table.
Absolutely, but Africa don't owe us reparations. They owe us as a people internal reparations, just like we owe ourselves as a people internal reparations. Here's what I want to say.
Dr. Umar is so out of touch with this subject. The reparation movement in America isn't even focused on international compensation, not yet anyway. American Freedmen are specifically focused on acknowledgement, redress, and closure for the atrocities that happened in America during chattel slavery and remedying the badges of slavery that still plague our communities today. But if you want to bring up an international claim, I would have to say everybody that was complicit in the transatlantic slave trade, including African nations and kingdoms, do owe reparations. And there's no such thing they owe us internal reparations. No, you owe us reparations.
A cash payout for reparations is a trap. And the reason a cash payout for reparations is a trap is because so much of what needs to be fixed in American society for African people will take more than cash to do it. In other words, I give DJ Envy $233,000. Or if I take the Bob Johnson plan, he said each American African is due $350,000, right? I give you $350,000. Does that stop mass incarceration?
Nope.
Does that stop miseducation? Does that stop gentrification? Does that stop police genocide? Does that guarantee us access to wealth? I mean, in the state of California, what can you get with $233,000? I'm not even sure if that's enough for a house. And on top of that, the minute they give you the payment, they can reduce the value of the payment through inflation. So I can flood the economy with money so the 233 is only worth 120 in about 24 hours. And then guess what they're going to do after they give the reparations to African people? They're going to find subsidy programs to give to the LGBTQ, to the women, to immigrants, to other people. So at the end of the day, what looked like a step up for black people would be a step back.
So let me get this right. You don't mind soliciting funds from these same poor black folks to build a school. But when it comes to the government paying out cash payments, you got all the excuses in the world. The reason our trauma lingers on is because in America, everything costs. And as a community, we don't have the resources to get the help that we need. Reparations is the most important conversation in the American Freedman community today. But you can't just shoot from the hip. You got to actually know what you're talking about. And Dr. Umar doesn't know what he's talking about. One of the reasons is he doesn't follow no real reparations organization. He doesn't follow anybody at all. Almost 900,000 followers, and this man is following 0 people. Dr. Umar is a reparations obstructionist. He doesn't even know the black buying power is a myth. If you want to learn about this reparations movement and get involved, here are some great organizations: CJAC, NAASD, Go on their website at NAASD.org, download the Repair Act, the United States Freedman Project, and the United Sons and Daughters of Freedmen. That's USADOF.org. And before you go, here's the legal definition of reparation, given to you by our sister Camilla Moore.
I'll add, as an international human rights scholar, there's a legal definition for what reparations is. So under international law, reparations comes in 5 forms. So compensation or cash must be included because that's one of the forms of reparations under international law. But there's also restitution, and that accounts for stolen land, stolen labor, stolen property, real or intellectual. So that's relevant in the entertainment space in terms of the cultural contributions of African Americans, right? The other form of reparations under international law is rehabilitation. So that can look like free medical care from birth to death, free education, free legal and trauma services. Then there's satisfaction, which accounts for more symbolic forms of reparations, like a formal apology, the taking down of Confederate monuments, and the erecting of statues that honor our ancestors, for instance. And then the last, or the 5th form of reparations under international law is guarantees of non-repetition. So that gets at more structural and institutional policy change. So my personal opinion is that you cannot call a reparations package reparations unless it includes all 5 of those forms. So it has to include cash, it has to include a check, it has to include restitution, it has to include rehabilitation, it has to include satisfaction, and it has to include guarantees of non-repetition.